Hello, everyone. This is your favorite history buff, and we are traveling with history. Today, I want to go over one of our founding fathers. That's right, the first American president, George Washington. The most iconic man. This will be part 1 of 3 in a series, because there's so much to cover. I wanted to do a little bit of a split. This was in the plan for a while, but I wanted to make sure to get this properly done. I'm going to go through his youth, go through his experience in the military, his political experience a little, and go through a few other things he's learned in life. Perhaps his dreams, or we're not going to cover his favorite food of hoe cakes, but we will cover him. Let's begin. Alright. George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732 to Augustine and Mary Bell. He had 5 younger siblings and 4 older half-siblings. His older half-siblings were Lawrence, Augustine Jr., Jane, and Butler. Sadly, only Lawrence and Augustine Jr. survived toward adulthood. The other ones passed. His younger siblings were Elizabeth, Samuel, John, Charles, and Mildred. Of course, his father owned several farms. Ferry Farm, for instance, Rappahannock River. And of course, George Washington at a young age was traumatized by house fire. And of course, the other part of this was how his education went. And of course, beforehand, he had moved with his family to what would today be Mount Vernon, but it wasn't called that back then. He had inherited his twist came when his father died. He was 11 years old. He couldn't get the education his half-brothers could, which was in Appleby School, which was in England. So he had a different kind of education. He also helped his mother around the plantation. She needed all that help, inherited 12 slaves from his father's will. Wasn't exactly a pleasant experience, hard childhood, but one that would form him, one that would define him through American history. And he had a rocky relationship with his mother, but I can cover that a little later on. But other than that, he was a responsible older sibling. Although he did have some role models in his life. Now, his education. See, private tutors, perhaps local schools. Since he couldn't learn all the unique stuff that Lawrence and Augustine Jr. learned, he still had his education set out for him. Of course, he did a lot of reading, writing, geometry, and trigonometry. Oh, and he never attended college or received a true formal education, although he did learn a great deal. As a matter of fact, he was also an avid reader, and it led on eventually to his career as a surveyor. He also, when he was 14 years old, copied the 110 Rules of Civility. Pardon me. So yes, he took this pretty seriously. It wasn't like there were many other opportunities. But that also led through his complete time through the explorations and the lands, everything. His opportunities would come later on in life. He had The Complete Surveyor by William Le Borgne. Matter of fact, that's pretty much what defined him for the rest of his life. For his military experience, it was that indeed he was to be. Now, he had role models such as his older half-brother Lawrence Washington. Of course, he took him on to surveying. He also had the Fairfax family, which that one was quite a close relationship, his neighbor and his mentor. Although he does consider his first love Sally Fairfax, who was already married. I believe her husband was George Washington's mentor, but, George was a flirt. Wrote love poems about the scenery. Always flirted with Sally, even in adulthood. There was no affair that was on record, so we'll leave it at he was just a flirt, before, during, and after his presidency. Also had the influence of aristocrats, very powerful connections to families. Also learned about honor and reputation. It is all this and the surveying that made it quite special. Now, talk about his career as a surveyor. He started at a young age. As you can see on top, it says it's a respectable profession. It happened during the 18th century. So why wouldn't he want to be a surveyor? Of course, later on, he would use that to acquire land or protect it, profit it. It is. For instance, a place he surveyed was Hellhole near Little Hunting Creek. He also surveyed a lot of Western Virginia, a certain tract of wasteland. His tools, surveyor's compass and staff, surveyed the Shenandoah lands. He actually also learned quite some lessons, because he slept on a bed made of straws. It was covered in lice and fleas and other pests. He didn't do that again. So, he slept in the open air before a fire. And of course, there was a bit of a hamper in it, such as when his older brother Lawrence died. You could say that made him go from professional surveyor to, self-service. It was a haunting or a tragic situation for him, understandably. So he really loved his half-brother. Learned a lot from him. As part of the lessons. And, let's move on to another point, because there's still more exciting bits. Now, before I get to the French and Indian War, George Washington did want to join the Navy, but his mother would not have it. She forbade him from doing it. You could say she was a bit controlling of his life. Despite him not getting his dream to join the Navy, that didn't stop him from joining the Army, which later on would lead to great things. So his mother's control, it kind of backfired and helped the rest of this country. Now, this was during the time when America was still a bunch of colonies under British rule, called the French and Indian War. Otherwise, in other places around the world, they called it the 7-Year War. And this is the first time George Washington would serve in the military. Picture of him in uniform, a younger George Washington. He would have a Virginia militia, a military force, and it would be ordered by the Brits. Or should I say the British? Let me be respectful of them, of course. They had a well-organized force. They were known as the most powerful army in the world at the time. Anyways, I know you all want to get to the French and Indian War, so let's get to it. Now, and George Washington joined the military. He obviously had his first conflict. He was sent by Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie to confront the French in the Ohio Valley, and demand their surrender. He had to demand that the French stop harassing English traders. Obviously, in Ohio Valley, there's a lot of economic interests for family, for the British, for the French, allies overall. So it was very important. Well, obviously the French did not stop harassing them. They refused to surrender. And, of course, even during battles, George Washington was recorded in his journal, which was quite valuable. Even the Brits had it recorded for him. Later on, of course. Now, his first battle sparked a war. I guess they considered it a kind of a world war because it affected events around the world. He tried to do a sneak attack on the French only to be caught, but he still won that fight. Still survived unscathed. But there was also a bit of problems to come later on. Just after the attack on Jumonville Glen, was it Claude-Pierre Pecaudy de Contrecoeur? Forgive me, French names are tough. He was the veteran French commander at Fort Duquesne. He ordered Captain Louis Coulon de Villiers to assail Washington and his forces. Well, that was a mouthful. Well, and of course they succeeded. This was the only time George Washington ever surrendered in his life. And I'm sure there are many battles to come. He was shafted, which they looked down upon by the Brits. This was a new time for him. He did get time to prove his leadership later on, such as when he was under Edward Braddock, a British commander. And of course, his forces were defeated by smaller French numbers. You could say his tactics didn't work. Battle of Monongahela. It was George Washington's success in rallying Braddock's forces for a proper retreat, possibly saving many lives. It's also a success at Fort Duquesne. Well, let's just say that was very helpful for him. He finally got some victories on, we could say, almost 5 years. He marched very hard, plenty of setbacks, and he had a lot of combat, but he finally claimed success. There's nothing wrong with that. But let's just say, after all this, he wanted a promotion, a reward of sorts, payment, I may believe. Well, actually, he wanted more respect. I'm sure payment would come with a promotion. But the British did not exactly give him that. They denied his request. They treated him like he was beneath them, and that would affect his attitude later on. No doubt the British would regret that later on. But their loss is our gain. And, well, George Washington took that to heart. He took a lot of his lessons and experience from the French and Indian War, or if you prefer, the 7-Year War. It wasn't exactly an easy moment, but it was all necessary for him. Seeing the picture, believed as Braddock's band, was given a sense of honor, I believe. I forgot to mention Edward Braddock did die in battle. He was buried in an unmarked grave, but Washington did honor him. It was a nice gesture, if you ask me. It is, indeed. Let his reputation come to blossom amongst Americans. Now, let's get to the part of his romance. Martha Dandridge Curtis. Obviously, she was married before to Daniel Park Curtis. Beautiful widow inherited her late husband's estate since she wasn't in his will. It was an interesting moment. She had 4 children with him. Of course, and George Washington would eventually court her, meet her in history. Nobody knows when the first meeting really happened, but it looks like it went off quite well. Not only did he court her and give generous tips for household slaves, but they had an overall enjoyable time. Meetings. They had those meetings in the months. Quite a long time. And, well, before you know it, their time would come with marriage. And, well, that's further proof of their love. He improved his home. She ordered wedding items from London. They married on January 6, 1759. Let's just say he adopted her children as his own. He was a very generous stepfather. Took very seriously their education. They also moved into his home of Mount Vernon. She would be very supportive of him. The only sad part was they never had any natural children together. Yes, they exchanged letters while he was away on business. And this was during military and political times as well. I know they tried as they might. They tried to have children together, but nobody knows why it couldn't happen. Could have been the pain she suffered from her last child. Could be a lack of fertility on his behalf. He even went to the mountain spa hot springs to increase his chance of fertility. You could say it didn't quite work out so well. What a shame, too. I think he would have been a great natural father. I know she was a great natural mother. Obviously, there's a picture of Martha in her younger days. Lovely lady. They had their overall great relationship. As I repeat, their love just grew stronger every time, even to the end of their lives. It was admired by many people, including Marquise de Lafayette later on. They were a model couple. I guess you call them the mother and father of America. That's what I'd call them. Anyways, along her helping him out and him showing his love and affection to her, there are other parts of the stories that I've left to get on to. She was his rock. I guess he was hers too. Well, anyways, why don't I get a move on for you all? Now, this is a very big moment. This was a prelude to the American Revolution. You could say, like many other Americans, George Washington had a problem with the overbearing taxes from the British government. Yeah, taxation without representation is theft. But he also had a political moment before his time in the Revolutionary War. And of course, before his time as President of the United States. He served in the Virginia House of Burgess, Despite losing the election in 1755, he won it in 1758. He served from 1758 to 1765 in Frederick County before serving from 1766 to 1776 in Fairfax County. I guess this wasn't the most prevalent time, but it gained him political experience. Of course, during that time, there was still the unfair treatment from the British. Obviously, he was paid less for his tobacco than others were. A lot of Americans were like that, mistreated. Unfortunate case, but that's what happened. This was, how should I say, a powdered keg waiting to happen. An explosion, so to speak. Now, let's get to the Revolutionary War. I think I've dragged this on long enough for you all. Now, George Washington was a Virginian of the Congress. John Adams, future vice president, future president, would nominate George Washington as commander-in-chief, and others would agree. Let's just say John Adams knew he wasn't as likable as George Washington. And he was a Virginian after all. John Adams from Massachusetts. And a Virginian could unite them all. Now, obviously he was in at least 17 battles. He had tugged on his conscience for slavery over the years, though he still was a slave owner till the end of his time. He had a spy network. He had lightning tactics and guerrilla warfare. And 6 months at Valley Forge, which was in between such. Well, he had helpers, allies like Nathaniel Greene, general. Of course, General Henry Knox, who would be his first Secretary of War later on during his presidency. And the Frenchman, General Marquis de Lafayette, who was like a son figure to him. I guess I shouldn't forget Alexander Hamilton, who would later become George Washington's Secretary of Treasury during his presidency. And of course, there's also Lieutenant Jean Baptiste Rochambeau. And of course, General Anthony Wayne. And of course, General Benedict Arnold, who had a complicated life and would betray the Americans, but, well, it's not so simple. I could perhaps tag it in as another story. He also had allies and Inspector General Frederick Wilhelm Baron von Steuben, a former Prussian commander, I believe, who helped him out a lot. During the Revolutionary War, the Americans had help from France, Spain, and the Netherlands. They helped with the training of the troops, providing them with resources, providing with extra soldiers. And George Washington would, of course, try to turn his ragtag hunters and farmers into soldiers. Sure, he had that help. Now, about his 17 battles. Can't say I'll go into it all. It would take a while. Of course, the Siege of Boston, which was an American victory, and Henry Knox, or General Henry Knox, provided him with the cannons during that battle. There's also George Washington's defeat in Long Island, the Battle of Long Island. His defeat in the Battle of Kips Bay. His victory at the Battle of Harlem Heights. And his defeat at the Battle of the White Plains. His defeat at the Battle of Fort Washington. Lost in retreat. His defeat at the evacuation of Fort Lee. His victory at the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey. His other victory in the Battle of Second Trenton. His victory at the Battle of Princeton. The 4-Inch War, which was for the draw. the Battle of Brandywine, which was a defeat, the Battle of the Clouds, which was a draw, Battle of Germantown, which was a defeat, Battle of White Marsh, which was a draw, Battle of Mammoth, which was a draw, and rather what infuriated George Washington, because Charles Lee was losing ground and ordered a retreat, which he wasn't supposed to. That infuriated both George Washington and Marquis de Lafayette. Squeaky-voiced Charles Lee couldn't get the job done. And to think people like him and Horatio Gates went to George Washington's job as the commander-in-chief to try to oust him. Obviously, they both ended in disgrace in their times. Oh, and there was finally the Siege of Yorktown. Now, that was the final battle before the British surrendered, blocked by the French Navy from escape, but the Americans and the French had him on the ground. I did forget to mention his opponents, like Sir Henry Clinton, and his second in command, who would eventually become the primary opponent to George Washington, Charles Cornwallis. I guess very formidable men themselves, but didn't exactly go all the way through. I did forget to mention at the Valley Forge, that was when Washington's men truly went through hell. But they managed to become full-fledged fighting force, despite having to eat their own boots. Although it was nice for Martha to visit George and his troops to give him a morale boost. That I could say for sure. It was something that helped them all. Yeah, half a year there, not exactly a pleasant thought. Anyways, back to the Siege of Yorktown, the surrender, and Cornwallis, sending one of his officers to present the surrender. I guess he didn't want to do it in person. Most powerful army losing to a ragtag troop of Americans isn't exactly good for the reputation. We weren't the most powerful country back then, as we are now. Although there was also Washington's help with other things later on. He wanted to retire as a private citizen, but people wanted him back, called back into action. Era of goals of Confederation was prelude to the Constitution, kind of a weak form of government. They still had to deal with the issues like representation between small and large states, constitutional republic, states' rights versus federal government control, executive power, which would eventually be the presidency. There would also be the problem of slavery. Well, you have to understand. Well, I believe slavery is wrong. We all do. Back then, that was the social standard. You had to look at it through their view and not through a modern view to understand more on that issue. Even as I said earlier, George Washington struggled with consciousness of slavery. There's also the commerce, or the trading, say, business. Well, there was a lot to deal with, but before I get into anything, I wanted to stop right here because I wanted to save part 2 for his presidency, the election and all. I figured this would be as good a place as any, so I could gather my thoughts. I wanted to separate that as an entire new video. I figured it'd be more informative that way. And I wouldn't spend more than 30 minutes on that. Well, anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. I see a few resources. It took me a while. A lot of it from the Mount Vernon website. That's quite informative. Well, Bye now.